All right, so we are back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Father Stephen Koeth, who is a Holy Cross priest. He's also the assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, and he is the author of this book, Crabgrass Catholicism, which very excited for Cracks in Postmodernity listeners to get to hear us discuss because it covers so many topics that we touch on in our Substack, on our podcast, and our content. It was so interesting to me that I ended up writing two reviews of it in First Things and in Arc. So, Father Stephen, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a real pleasure.
So yeah, this book, again, like it covers a lot of our topics of interest, suburbanization, urban planning, ethnic Catholicism, white flight, all these different things. But tell us, what is it that sparked the idea to write this book?
Well, when I was a doctoral student at Columbia University, I had proposed a dissertation topic and had gotten approval of it, and then I found another researcher was working on that topic, so I kind of blew that up and started over. And so I read broadly and thought big thoughts, and I came across an article written by Thomas Segru, the eminent urban historian. In this article, he's talking about religion and urban studies, and in particular Catholicism. And he points out that we just knew and know so little about suburbanization and the way it affected American Catholicism. Urban historians focus on the city in a particular way, and uh, American Catholic historians, they probably tend to focus on the urban, ethnic, political machine, et cetera, et cetera. Suburbanization was kind of assumed or glossed over, but it wasn't studied in depth. And I thought to myself, well, that's something I could do. That's something that's of great interest to me. I kind of grew up in a semi-suburban area of New York City. I was very close to Long Island at Columbia University, so I had access to archives and resources, and it was a topic that really interested me and felt personal on some level and very doable. And so I jumped right in, and it's been a great topic to explore.
Yeah, so your kind of central case study is Diocese of Rockville Center in
Yeah.
Long Island, which is kind of, a paradigmatic example of what happened in a lot of other parts of the country. You know, these ethnic Catholics living in the cities who eventually make enough money to move out to the suburbs. You know, they follow a kind of similar pattern. So kind of just map out for us, what is that pattern that you noticed, in the story of Rockville Center? What is it that happened from this move to, New York City to the suburbs, which again is like an example of what happened in other parts of the country?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. It is paradigmatic, and I shouldn't just kind of speak of it as, oh, I had access to it. It was
Yeah.
nearby to New York, because I point out that when Levittown is built in 47 and Nassau County starts booming, by 1957, the Vatican recognizes this and establishes a new diocese to
Mm.
cover Nassau and Suffolk counties, splitting those counties off of the Diocese of Brooklyn, which was Brooklyn and Queens. And the whole nation takes note of this. And they say, see, the Vatican's recognizing that the future of the church in this country is suburban. And this phenomenon of suburbanization is happening all over the country. We should be watching what's going on in Rockville Center because we can learn lessons, what to do, what not to do, whatever. So it was the right place to study this topic. And part of what I found is all the things that we already know about suburbanization in terms of the importance of the highway system being built, the importance of the GI Bill and FHA loans, and the financing of suburban structures. But I'm focusing in particular on how did the churches building up of a ecclesial infrastructure affects the suburbs, and
Mm.
how did those suburban structures affect the practice of the faith and Catholic politics. And I found that I think what I found could be universally said of suburbs across the country. How parishes came to be established, whether it was by lay initiative or by the pre-planning of the diocese. How did they come to be funded, again, by the diocese or by the parishioners who made up that parish? Um, the way that these parishes changed the relationship between clergy and laity, the way it changed the stress or the emphasis on Catholic education, and the way it shifted Catholic politics from a kind of communal, working class union kind of focus on employment and labor rights to a politics that focused on family values and education and taxes, especially. So that's a quick summary of kind of the three kind of bullet points that the book goes into in terms of how suburbanization changed the church.
And what was interesting to me is that before this kind of mass uprooting to the suburbs, you do see Catholics who are disillusioned with urban life because, first of all, the cities are getting overcrowded, but then also these kind of fears about the immorality of city life, that kids are getting into delinquency and all kinds of sinful behaviors.
Yes.
And you see this talk of, going back to the land,
Yes.
trying to you see this with Dorothy Day. You see these other agricultural movements are saying, we got to go back to the rural, to the farming, agricultural work. And, I mean, classically, there's always been this understanding of the symbiotic relationship between the country and the city, and that, both need each other. So if the city's overcrowded, you got to kind of pivot back a little bit. But, once the suburbs started to grow, I mean, some Catholics said, hey, this is a kind of best of both worlds because
Mhm.
it's not as remote as the country, but it's not as wild as the city. And my whole thing with that kind of mentality is that, I mean, it's the best of neither worlds
Right.
because you don't actually farm, you don't actually cultivate the land, but also you don't have the kind of social and cultural life of the city. So, I mean, but say a little bit more about that kind of
Yeah.
phase within the shift to suburbia and what
Yeah,
Catholics saw
it's one
there.
of the ironies that I try to narrate
Yeah.
is that it is when American Catholicism is its most urban from
Mm,
the era of immigration in the 1800s through the Second World War. You have not just the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, right? Who are pushing people to be in farming communities and trying to support Catholics in farming communities.
mm,
That wasn't surprising to me that they denigrated the city and worried about the city and stressed rural life, but that the social action director of the Diocese of Brooklyn is echoing these sentiments of the Catholic Rural Life Conference was
mm.
surprising to me. But they did. They kind of touted the rural life as a way to ensure family values and ensure the passing on of the faith. The city is a place where people have smaller families, they contracept, and there's more immorality and vice and juvenile delinquency, as you say. And so, move out. And precisely when American Catholics do move out to the suburbs, in part because, as you say, they thought of it as the best of both worlds. They thought of it as kids are going to have a front lawn to play in. They're not going to be playing in the gutter, and there is housing available, and it's actually cheaper thanks to the GI Bill and thanks to the FHA loans. And after World War II, when there's this housing crisis, these GIs who come back from the war, they don't have enough urban housing. So it seemed like all the right answers. And it's precisely at that moment that American Catholic leadership kind of gains a new appreciation for the urban, right? For the ethnic neighborhood, for the interracial aspect of urban life, or the potentiality of that. Of course, this is then the urban crisis. White flight is undermining, municipal funding and infrastructure. And so, yeah, it is one of the ironies that I point out. Um, I think that the criticism then of the suburbs is very much what you articulate. It's the best of neither world. The phrase that often gets used is it's a ready-made slum. These are poorly built buildings. They're built rapidly, and they're really just going to deteriorate over quickly. They're not much bigger than an urban apartment. So they talked about this as birth control housing. Catholic leaders did. You're going to have smaller families there too. Um, yeah, and I cite an article from the Brooklyn Catholic newspaper, an editorial that kind of asks, okay, well then where are we supposed to live? Like if the city is you've been saying for so long is so bad, and now the suburbs are so bad, where are we supposed to go? And I do think it's kind of a little bit of a sad irony.
Yeah, so I want to focus on the kind of so like there's the kind of material factors that play a role in this change, but you do give a fair amount of attention to the spiritual and cultural changes to Catholic life in this move to the suburbs, and you cite a lot of Andrew Greeley's work,
Yeah.
which
Mhm.
really fleshes out all of this as it's happening on the ground.
Mhm.
And there's this. I forget which, there's a passage where he kind of describes like the kind of enchanted feel of the Catholic urban enclave where, you're just walking past, you're walking down the street and you walk past the parish and you go in to light a candle and then there's a procession and then you see your neighbors and you see the priest. And there's a sense that like the spirit is alive in this
Mhm.
kind of environment. Whereas when you move to the suburbs, you only go to the parish when you drive there for mass or for other events. Like it's not spontaneous.
Yep.
But aside from just like the religious aspect, you're not walking past your neighbors as much. You're not walking down the
Yeah.
street to get bread. So like this kind of atomized or individual lonely feeling starts to spread in the suburbs, which is not, I mean, I never found it conducive to a life of
Hmm.
faith. It's
Hmm.
impossible. Um, and I mean, it's like I have my more kind of like, for lack of a better term, doomerist reading of, this idea that Catholicism is bound to like it's just that the suburbs are ontologically opposed to it, which again, I mean, it's an extreme view. But what you say, I mean, just like really looking at your research, that it's more a failure of parishes to adapt to the suburban environment, that they kind of naively kind of slapped on the urban model that they were using before, not realizing that suburban life does totally change the dynamic of how one lives the faith and how one, is involved in the parish. So, I mean, say a little bit more about what you saw and that kind of naivete and the shift from the urban to the suburban parish model.
Yeah, I think this was both parishioners and priests, so I don't want to blame any one group, and bishops too. And I don't want to, again, point a ton of blame just because they were doing their best. The parishes are booming, growing exponentially and rapidly. And so it was natural for them to try to say, well, we're just going to recreate what we know. We're gonna build a parish plant. It's going to have the church and the school and the convent and the rectory and the gym like it always has. We're going to transplant the parish associations that we've always had, the Holy Name Society and the Rosary Altar Guild, etc., and just kind of transfer the model as best we can. And it made sense that they did that. Um, but it was also happening at a time of great religious and social change in other ways, right? I mean, I don't get into a ton of this, but I reference it and point out this is, of course, the advent of television and the
Yeah.
and the popularity of that, and of course, there's religious change. I'm pointing to a lot of things that lead up to Vatican II and kind of anticipate it, but then Vatican II has its own kind of influence on all of this. So it's not surprising that the church had a hard time finding its sea legs, so to speak, right? Kind of getting the sense of this new reality and how pastorally it was a new challenge. Um, I'm kind of citing in a lot of ways the people on the ground, uh, priests who did oral interviews with the diocese in the 1970s and 80s, who had been parish priests in the 50s and 60s, who they themselves are saying, yeah, boy, we started great guns, and there were so many people coming for baptism and wedding prep, and we were just overwhelmed. And but then it all kind of trailed off, right? And they themselves are saying we kind of lost the suburbs. We didn't have a new model. The CCD, which was a new model, not entirely new. It had existed in the city, of course, for students who go to public schools. Where do they get their religious education? CCD after school or on the weekends. That model had existed, but it becomes dominant in the suburbs.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough. It didn't pass the faith on sufficiently, and they're themselves are looking back from the 70s, 80s, even the early 90s on their own lives and their role in this suburbanization of the church. And they're saying, yeah, we didn't have these answers we to this new reality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the CCD thing versus the parish school, it's interesting because in the beginning, I mean, you did have priests and religious who were available to teach, without the need for a full salary, which made it easier to run the schools. And like you said, there's, this initial boom, but then it trailed off. I think on one hand, because yeah, like people started secularizing and losing the faith, but also because if with the decline of, vocations, it becomes much harder to sustain these schools if you have to pay lay teachers. So, this shift to the CCD model was more efficient, but you cited this kind of statistic that um, people who go to Catholic schools, even if they lapse for a while, usually do come back to the faith, whereas people who just went to CCD and into public school, it's less likely that they'll, find the faith again, which like I thought of all the people I know, and it's actually true. Like all the people I know who are not super devout, but who still believe did go to
Mhm.
Catholic schools. It's an interesting,
Yeah, it's been interesting since the book has come out to have people reach out and say, "Oh, Father, thank you. This tells my story. I either grew up on Long Island or grew up in northern New Jersey or grew up outside of Chicago or whatever. And, here's how my story resonates with what you're telling." And this is one of the points that people point to most as a point of resonating. Oh, I went to a Catholic school, but my cousins who grew up in the same suburb didn't, or whatever, friends down the street didn't.
yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. You mentioned earlier that I cite Andrew Greeley quite a bit. One, I started with him because he writes, in a certain sense, the last book-length study of Catholic suburbanization in the late 1950s, the church in the suburbs. Um, but also because he does so much of this sociological data
Yeah.
on priests and are they happy in their ministry and how do they view their ministry, on the laity, are they going to mass, are they getting married in the church, are they not, and then especially he's very strong on Catholic education, and as only Andrew Greeley could, I suppose, just excoriated the bishops in his writing and Catholic parents, basically saying Catholic education was the one thing in the 1960s that brought Catholics together. They were divided by Vietnam, they were divided by women's ordination, they were divided by contraception. The one thing that the polls all showed is that Catholics universally agreed Catholic schools are a good thing.
Mm.
He's like, well, then, but then why did we lose our nerve? And if we all believed that, how did we not put our money where our mouth is and build enough and have enough to put kids in Catholic schools? And then if we did, here's the result. The result is it is the best indicator he found in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, at least, the best indicator of lifelong or return to the practice of the faith is whether or not you had some Catholic education. And so Greeley is crucial to the study. And again, points out one of the greatest ill effects of suburbanization.
But my whole thing though with, the practical issue of needing the money to run the schools, it goes back to the vocation crisis, which goes back to my whole issue with the suburbs in itself that sure, okay, if you send your kids to the suburban parish school, they'll eventually come back to the faith. But I do think because suburban life is oriented to this very bourgeois, ultimately
Yeah,
secular, rootless ideal, you're less likely to have people who are devout to the point that they want to discern a call to
yeah,
give themselves completely to God and the church. So, I mean, I think that's a part of it. That's part of the reason why you have this decline in vocations. But I'm curious. So again, I acknowledge that I have this pessimistic
yeah,
reading of the suburbs, and I said in the review in ARC that of course God can intervene. God can do.
yeah,
He can go into the suburbs if he wants. I know some very devout people, but I'm curious to know what do you observe in the suburbs that that you visited, that you researched, where do you see that there is a real active faith life? Where do you see the hope
yeah.
within the current suburbs, the churches in the suburbs?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where I put on not just my scholarly historian's hat, but a little bit of my priestly and ministerial, vision. Um, yeah, I think that on Long Island, for example, one of the places that you see real vitality, and it's not surprising, is the way that these suburbs are now much more diverse than they were when they were founded.
Interesting. Okay.
And so the Latin American and Asian presence would be much higher. And there has been quite a bit of work by urban and suburban scholars talking about how do these immigrants
Mhm.
reshape the way that we even live in these suburban spaces because they're not as car centric as the suburbs are actually structured to be. They're more communal. They're more, and so I think that's a place where you see vitality in even the suburban church of the Northeast and Midwest, which that whole region, both city and suburb, have been. kind of struggling, for the past 40 years. But then I haven't done as much research in the suburbs of the Sun Belt South, for example. But I think
Interesting. Okay.
that would be an interesting place for someone, if this is the first book on Catholics and suburbs, since Greeley in the 50s. There should be a lot more scholarship. Somebody else should come along and say, I'm going to look at the suburbs as they developed outside of LA in the 50s,
Mm,
60s, 70s, 80s. How are they different? What about the suburbs of the 70s, 80s, 90s outside of Dallas? How are they different?
yeah.
I don't know those areas super well, but my sense and the time I have spent there is that despite being very suburban, and not just the suburbs of the 1920s and 30s, which are streetcar suburbs, or even the suburbs of the 50s and 60s, the Levitt towns, the suburbs of the 70s, 80s, 90s, they are, bigger property size lots, bigger houses, further apart, much more suburban in that sense of that word. Um, I think the church outside of Dallas and outside of Fort Worth is pretty strong.
Mm,
I think the church
okay.
outside of Atlanta is pretty strong. I think there's something to be looked at in terms of the presence of and the strength of evangelical churches in those areas.
Okay. That's
Uh,
interesting.
Do Catholic parishes in those areas respond as a kind of counterpoint? Well, we know that our people are going to be, approached to join this evangelical church. They're going to be surrounded by people who are faithful Christians, just not of our church. How do we provide something that's an answer?
Yeah.
How do we look to what they're doing by way of a model? Are they providing bereavement groups and Bible studies and youth groups that
Mm,
some suburban parishes don't do a very good job with?
yeah.
But there they do because they have to. It's the economy, so to speak, the religious economy. Again, I'm not expert in that in the same way as others might be or could be as they take up this mantle of suburban Catholic research. But that's my hunch that the despite our shared kind of skepticism about the suburbs,
Sure.
I think that without not writing it off completely, there are these hints, there are these places where maybe the model of pastoral and parish ministry was adapted to a suburban
Okay.
reality.
Interesting.
And maybe there are hints and glimmers of a vital suburban church.
Yeah, I mean, in my own observations, I think it has the life that I do see in suburban parishes has to do with like the ethnic presence.
Hmm.
Because again, like on the spiritual level, I very much believe that like when you have a strong sense of roots, that's
Hmm.
more conducive to
Yeah.
like understanding and desiring faith. So I see, yeah, I mean, in suburbs where there is a big Latino presence, but also even where there's a remnant of the Italian presence, that the faith is alive. Because, again, I said this in the review that the faith it has to be parasitic on something because we believe in the incarnation. It has to attach itself to a physical human reality. And when it's a living culture, like, okay, I mean, the faith becomes more alive. So
Hmm.
I mean, that's my hope. But again, when are they going to assimilate? Are they going to lose the culture? Are they going to lose their faith? It's to be seen. But
Absolutely. That's
yeah.
exactly right. Yeah. And so one of the things that I would say is maybe it's about intentionality. Uh,
Mhm.
a fifth generation a German American Catholic probably isn't going to be able to recapture the ethnic
Yeah.
Catholicism of their great 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 grandparents in terms of trying to pass the faith on to their own children. But how do they recreate intentionally
Hmm.
something of that urban ethnic enclave that would be thick enough, a kind of rooted
Yeah.
to pass the faith on to the next generation? So it probably does involve a kind of an intentionality of, well, where do we live? Around
Yes.
whom do we live? We go to mass, we send the kids to the Catholic school because we want the kids that they go to school with and the kids that they play on the soccer team with and the kids that they see on the street
Hmm.
playing after school tag. We want there to be those same values, that same community, that
Yeah.
same, ethos. So I think it can be replicated in some way. It just can't be, duplicated exactly.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I see this. So, two examples. I visited Rochester in upstate New York, and I visited a parish where that is, I mean, in the like suburban part of Rochester, where the pastor is, he like has bought up property, he's bought up houses near the parish and is having young families move in order to create
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
neighborhood, which I mean,
Yep.
I'm super impressed by, and I think it's clearly very effective because these young people are super active in the faith and in the
Yes.
parish. But in terms of the ethnic thing, like I've written about in Newark, New Jersey, and the Newark Archdiocese, there is an Italian apostolate, which is mainly run by people in their late 20s, early
Okay.
30s,
Uh-huh.
who, and I mean, there are other people too, people in up to their 80s, but they realize that their grandparents' traditions of, the saint feasts and all that, it's gonna die out if
Mhm.
they don't keep it alive. So like they're really doing incredible work to
Yes.
raise the funds to keep the feast going, to get more people coming. And they've done, I have to say, especially in Newark, because of, there's a history of racial strife that like they've really gone out of their way to include everybody,
Yeah.
including the Latino immigrants, the African immigrants, like everybody's involved. And it's to me that like that's a very hopeful thing to see that, in the face of assimilation, there are people trying to maintain their ethnic and Catholic traditions,
No, that's absolutely right. And again, I'm an historian, so I'm more comfortable 50 and 60 years ago than I am current day. But just reading some of the articles that have been published in the last couple of months, even about the revivification, seemingly, of the faith among 20 somethings, 30 somethings, and some of these urban settings. My sense would be that. An ethnic inflected faith, a practice of the faith that has these processions and these saint
yeah,
days and these cultural traditions is particularly appealing to this younger generation that is
yeah,
coming back to the church or whatnot. It that might not be their family background, or I kind of have to kind of think through how does that translate. But I do think again, what we're kind of getting at, I guess, on the 30,000 foot view, is a thick vision of religion.
yeah,
It's not religion is not an hour a week on a Sunday morning.
yeah.
It's layers upon layers of connectivity, culturally and familially, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think, with this whole Zoomer religious revival, I've been critical of, the fact that for a lot of these young people, there is this ideological bent,
Correct.
which it's like I totally end up. I mean, I'm not a Zoomer. I'm a, late millennial, but I do get the sentiment. Like when I came back to faith, like it is driven by this sense of this emptiness, like which I think growing up in the suburbs played a role in, like not being involved in like a very active faith life, parish life, but also that, yeah, I mean, it was an assimilated suburb. You feel this need for roots, for a foundation, for meaning in life. Um, and the things like, especially with like the trad iteration of this religious revival, there's something very real in this need to like to recover a sense of tradition, to be tied to be rooted in something in the past. My fear with, I mean, I love Latin Mass
Mhm.
as a liturgy, but again, the kind of ideological piece of it, concerns me because what you're doing is you're trying to invent a tradition. You're like, let's go back in the history of the church. Let's pick pieces and invent a tradition. And I'm like, well, that's totally counterintuitive because tradition is something that's passed down to you
Mhm.
from someone else. Like it's not something you invent. That's an extremely modernist kind of posture to
Yeah.
take.
Mhm.
Whereas with the ethnic reality, like when I go to the Italian feast, they're literally these old Italians who are passing down a living tradition
Yes.
to me as a young person, which I hope to pass on to other people.
Yes.
Um, and there isn't this ideological fervor behind it because it's integrated into real life. It's integrated into the culture. So
Yeah.
as much as like I totally understand this need to be
Yeah.
part of a tradition, I like when I meet these young converts, I'm like, go to an ethnic parish if you want tradition. Like go,
Yeah.
in Manhattan, we have the huge feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which goes
Yeah.
on for like over 24 hours.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's a living tradition if you want
Correct. Yeah.
tradition,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't disagree at all, and I think kind of what I write about in the book, I think kind of validates that or echoes that in the sense that um, what I how I phrase this change that suburbanization created is religion was part of the your identity and of the identity of the neighborhood, and because it was just it was in the air, was in the water that you drank and breathed, and you couldn't help it. And in the suburbs, and again, this is Greeley, religion
Mhm.
becomes just one more thing that you consume, that you
Yeah, yeah,
choose. Well, I'll take the pink refrigerator instead of the green refrigerator, and I'll, join this country club instead of that country club, and blah blah blah. Oh, and yeah, I guess I'll go to this church. Well, that's just not the same as you say, having something past and being so kind of in your bones as
yes.
part of your identity.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that note, I do want to talk about, later on in the book, you talk about the emergence of the culture war, which,
Mhm.
I focused a little bit more on in the first things review, but you see this shift. I mean, I was really struck by these headlines that you got from different Catholic publications, some of which are still very active today, Commonweal, America, etc. That you see at a certain point, there's this pivot from focus on very material, common sense issues like housing, like taxation, etc., to more explicitly ideological, kind of moral ones.
Mhm.
Um, and you see how the move to the suburbs kind of spurs this because our political point of reference is no longer like the immediate circumstances. It becomes more, abortion and women's rights and freedom of religion. Not to say these aren't real issues, but again,
Yeah.
like you see the division, kind of like these hard divisions emerge because we're not really sharing life with different kinds of people anymore. There isn't this social friction. Um, so, I mean, say a little bit about that shift and the factors that kind of played a role into the development of the culture war within the church.
Yeah. So what I focus on is how the shift in Catholic education and the suburban shift to the focus on the nuclear family and,
Mm,
and, and
yeah.
domestic realities, how this drives this change. And so the two kind of political issues then would be kind of state funding for non-public schools and abortion. And I don't go into that as much. There's other scholars who have, but yeah, you can see how in a suburban reality where we can't build enough Catholic school buildings and have enough desks to house all of these kids fast enough, and we're paying suburban mortgages and suburban tax rates, we're going to struggle to then also pay tuition for a Catholic school, especially when that Catholic school now has to hire more lay people because there's not enough nuns. So there's all these knock-on effects.
Mhm.
So then the bishops and a large number of lay Catholic voters uh, kind of reinvigorate a long-standing Catholic demand, uh, state funding, some amount of tax money is going to private schools. And I narrate a debate in New York State in 1967 over a new state constitution, which would have eliminated the Blaine Amendment of the previous state constitution and allowed the state to provide some funding to non-public schools. Um, and so education is a focus. In the end, even Catholic sections of Long Island and Catholic sections of New York City and upstate New York vote against this new constitution. Some might say, oh, it's because they were very highly principled around the separation of church and state. Or it was pretty clear that they were voting their pocketbooks. They didn't want the tax rates to go up to get more to fund more schools. And so this again changed the focus, the foci that Catholic voters were paying attention to, and it becomes more domestic, and it becomes more on financing and tax rates and the family home. Other scholars have also focused on how Catholic housewives on Long Island were crucial in the shift of the state Republican Party from a Rockefeller kind of liberal Republican Party to a more conservative political party based on the fight against abortion in the late 60s and 70s, right? Um, and so it is, I would say, this shift to the suburbs, this shift to the family home as the center of that drives the political issues that are at the forefront.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's the thing that concerns me most is that this sense of my belonging to the church being the ultimate thing that defines who I am and my identity, that like I live this communion with Christ and with the body, is kind of lost within the factions of the culture where like you have the liberal Catholics who support X, Y, and Z and the conservative Catholics. And I'm like, it's natural that there's going to be factions within any religious group. You know, we see this throughout history, but especially with Christianity, this sense that like I am ontologically united to you, even if we're ideologically opposed through the Eucharist. Like when we start to prioritize these partisan loyalties over, the faith, like
Mhm.
I don't know, like we see this playing out right now within the American church, and I think it's just concerning that we lose sight of what is most essential. And not only that, but like, again, these issues, as much as they matter, I think are secondary to the more immediate, concrete ones that affect us in our everyday lives. Which is, I mean, it's harder to focus on that though, like if you're living in an environment where there is less social friction, where you're not forced to interact on a day-to-day basis with the people living around you. So I don't know. I mean, I'm curious, like, what do you see? How does like all the research you've done shed light on what you see happening in the American church right now?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, and I say this by the end of the book, that the church we live in, the American Catholic Church that we live in today, is a church that was created by and is the suburban church. It's this era that creates the church as we have it today. The church we have today is not the church that was created by massive European immigration in the
Yeah.
1850s. That church died, so to speak, with or diminished with the rise of the suburban church in the 50s and the 60s. And so the polarization that we'd see today, yeah, I point back to this era to say, um, that when you can choose, right, to
Yeah.
participate or not based on like any other consumer choice. Well, so too, even if you're going to practice the faith, you can choose to drive 5 minutes this way to this parish or 5 minutes this way
Yeah.
to this parish.
Yeah.
And I might pick that based on which has the better music or which has the better homily, or I might pick it based on, well, this parish is more liberal, this parish is. And so, as much as there was a criticism by some Catholics of the urban ethnic neighborhoods. Oh, they're dividing people by ethnicity. And even within the church, here's the Irish parish, here's the Italian parish, here's the Polish parish, and never the twain shall meet. We traded that division
Yeah.
for a different form of division, which is
Yeah.
it's political, it's ideological, right? And or it's liturgical styles, right? Which often overlap with kind of other kind of political
Yeah.
ideology. So yeah, I do think that in a lot of ways, a lot of what we talk about today as both strengths and weaknesses, but perhaps especially weaknesses of the church in the United States today are the effect of the way the church came to be shaped by suburbanization of the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, and I mean I do want to touch on the race issue a little bit because I've mentioned to you like it's close to my own family's history and um so Father Monsignor Gino Baroni, who you mentioned several times in the book, was a big influence on my own grandfather, who was politically involved in Newark. And the thing that always kind of stands out to me from Father Gino and my grandfather's kind of vision was this understanding that I mean, first of all, that there's something healthy about having an interracial, urban enclave where people are forced to interact with each other, not without conflict, but where they share life together. And that my grandfather's fear of, white flight and, the reason why he encouraged Italians not to just like all go en masse to the suburbs is that he understood that it was going to exacerbate the already tense race relations in the city. Um, and what you end up seeing is that with this move to the suburbs, you see like the kind of sympathetic white people who are like, oh yeah, we're not racist and we can support liberal policies, welfare that's going to help people of color. And then you have this kind of extreme racism that both in effect don't really help, underprivileged minorities. Whereas like staying in the city, again, not to say it's a utopia, there is racism, there's tension, which is natural. But again, the fact that you're forced to share life with each other and to interact with each other kind of mutes that like the heat of the tension, it like diminishes the heat. And I think there's a lot to learn from what went wrong in white flight today, because again, it's like a lot of the talk about racial justice today ends up becoming very abstract. Like you can say very nice, lofty, noble ideas about how you're anti-racist and I don't support, but it's like at the end of the day, like do you share life together? Like, are you actually doing concrete things to build unity and justice?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know, like just to go back to Father Gino, I think he really understood this insight about like the benefit of these kind of like inter multi-ethnic racial enclaves and how like the real solution to tension is coalition building, like actually working together with the different groups to accomplish something together rather than again this kind of like nice sentimental talk about equality.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, if you want to say a little bit more about like what you observe with the racial dynamic or about Father Gino
Yeah.
himself.
No, I would just say I agree 100%. I mean, my book is indebted to I mentioned Andrew Greeley or Ken Jackson, the great
Yeah.
suburban historian who wrote Crabgrass Frontier, from which my book's title comes. Also, John McGreevy, the great American Catholic historian who wrote Parish Boundaries, about race relations between Catholics and African Americans in the urban North.
Mhm.
Uh, and no, I'm telling a suburban story, a different story. But one of the things he says is that uh, race relations was an abstraction for white suburbanites because,
Yeah.
and that was the whole point. They left the suburb to flee these issues. But I think you're absolutely right that in the end, the most clear-eyed people on this matter were Gino Baroni and people like him who were kind of labeled the new ethnics or the ethnic
Yeah.
revivalists, right? And they were dismissed by some as if not outright racists, at least like, you're too concerned for your faction. You're a little, and that's not true. I think it was completely unfair to Baroni
Yeah.
and his ilk. I think you're absolutely right. He was very clear-eyed. He wanted to point out that urban white ethnics had also suffered from urban renewal and from white flight, just as blacks had, and maybe not to the same degree, but they had suffered too, and their neighborhoods were under stress, but they were often forgotten in kind of government policy. Precisely what you say, fleeing doesn't help. And yes, staying, there still might be some of that friction. There might still be some of that tension. But Baroni and all of these new urbanists or new ethnics, they were veterans of the civil rights movement. They were not bigots, at all. uh, but they said, let's maintain our Italian Catholic heritage, our Polish Catholic heritage, and in
Yeah.
some sense in emulation of a kind of black pride at that era, right? And then let's have these three groups: the Poles, the Italians, and the blacks, who all live in the same neighborhood. Let's together work on the issues that affect all of us in this neighborhood. What about housing? What about housing quality? What about education? What about jobs? And so coalition building as the kind of the answer, the antidote to this bifurcation based on ideology or race or the suburb versus the city. Yeah, I think that Baroni was absolutely kind of one of the heroes of clear-eyed, activists.
Yeah, and I mean, you see people like Novak, like
Yeah.
Moynihan, kind of championing this idea that in order to really embrace another culture, like you have to appreciate your own roots. Like you have to celebrate that you're Italian, that you're Irish, which again, it's like there's going to be tension. There will be moments where racist sentiment does come out, and we can't be squeamish, can't be moralistic about this. Like it's inevitable when you're interacting with other people to have tension. But again, what's more effective? Like having the tension, but trying to actually work together, or again, like saying very nice things while being completely removed from the people you claim to be an ally to, you know. So but it's true. Like I see in my own experience, like the more that I value my own roots, it's easier to appreciate someone else's culture and to see rather than the surface level. Like, yes, I respect your culture, but like if you don't know what it means to love a culture, like how can you really love the other person, you know?
Another translation of this into another issue that I talk about would be kind of mixed parishes, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
we don't tend to establish national parishes for Mexican immigrants the way we did for Italian immigrants of a previous generation. And so we have now a parish that had always been a Polish parish on the west side of South Bend,
Mhm.
for the last 75 or 80 or 100 years. And now all of a sudden there's a handful of elderly Polish parishioners left, but there's a whole lot of young Mexican American
Yeah.
families. Um, well, in my experience, and it's not a scholarly research, but those parishes actually work better in mixing those two communities because, as you say, they both have a rootedness in a tradition and a culture. Whereas again, in my limited experience, but the kind of generically white, kind of middle class parish has a much harder time
Yeah.
accepting and integrating and mixing with this, new Mexican American Catholic
Yeah.
population that is coming into the neighborhood. So I think you're right. If you have your own tradition, you're rooted in it. Can it cause tensions and can racism bubble up and of course, but it actually is a place from where you can dialogue and build coalition.
Yeah, no, and it's an interesting, there's a pattern I keep observing in New Jersey and some New York parishes that there are parishes especially named after Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which,
Right.
are typically Italian. Like you see this thing where like some of the old Italians remain. You have Hispanics, you have some Africans or West Indians, Filipinos maybe. And most of these parishes, like I see I see it like they find a way to like share their, respective forms of piety, traditions with each other. There are times where it doesn't work out,
Correct.
but when it does work out, like you see this kind of fruitfulness, you see this depth and this joy that you wouldn't see at like the kind of assimilated, but assimilated, albeit like very nice and welcoming parish. Like
Yep.
it's,
Yep.
so it's an interesting dynamic to see how the different groups are kind of welcoming each other and like I don't know, like I love in Newark, they still do the Feast of Saint Gerard. All
Yeah.
the old Italians come back, but now you see like the Nigerian priest is very much involved. You have the Puerto Ricans and Ecuadorians who are carrying the statue, and I'm like, this is what it's supposed to be. It's
Absolutely.
possible,
It is possible. That's right. Yep.
Yeah. So now just to wrap things up, I when I saw the title of the book, I mean, I freaked out because I was like, finally, somebody's doing this. But I think what impressed me most is just like the historical research, like the depth of historical research that went into it, but also that I really appreciate that you let the history speak for itself without inserting yourself too much into it because I don't know. I mean, it's for me, it's always disheartening, especially when priests kind of insert their own political or ideological reading into whatever they're talking about, because I think there is a need to respect the conscience, freedom of conscience of the lay people to kind of discern their own conclusions from whatever. So it was just very refreshing to me on that level as well. And, I'm very grateful to you for putting out this work.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I mean, you would focus on the priest's obligation to kind of not assert himself in that same way. And I agree entirely. As priests, we're to be alter Christus, we're not, it's not about me, Stephen
Yeah,
Caeth, who cares? But then also as an historian, I think it's our
exactly.
obligation in kind of fairness and sympathy to our historical subjects, right? To not bring too much of our own kind of worldview and ideology and impose it on our historical subjects, but as best we can to let their story speak for itself, let them when they can. I was lucky to find oral histories that had been done by the diocese, so that or interviews that were done in Catholic newspapers of parishioners and priests to let those people's voices come out of the history. I was invaluable, So that's what I was aiming to do. I'm glad that it might have resonated with at least one person.
So with that, I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Crabgrass Catholicism. And Father Stephen, thanks for coming on to talk about it.
Thanks, Stephen. My pleasure.